Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to tackle a very important topic from your civics syllabus, something that's right at the heart of how our democracy works: political parties. We'll be looking at the big challenges they face and, more importantly, what can be done to improve them.
So, let's start with a question you might have thought about yourself. Why is it that whenever we talk about what's wrong with our democracy, we often end up blaming political parties? It's a very common feeling, isn't it? This widespread criticism is actually the perfect place for us to start our honest look into how these parties really work.
Okay, here's our plan for today. First, we'll understand why parties get so much criticism. Then, we'll break down the 4 biggest challenges they face. After that, we'll look at the possible solutions and reforms, including the most important ingredient of all, which is you. And finally, we'll wrap up with some key points to help you with your exams.
So, back to that first question. Why all the criticism? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. It's because they are the most visible part of our democracy. For most ordinary people, political parties are the face of the government. So it's only natural that when we're unhappy with how the country is being run, we tend to blame the most visible institution, the parties themselves.
Now, this widespread dissatisfaction isn't just a feeling. It points to some very real, deep-rooted problems. So let's now carefully examine the 4 major challenges that political parties, not just in India, but all over the world, need to overcome.
The first major challenge is something we call a lack of internal democracy. What this means is that within the party itself, there isn't a proper democratic system. All the power tends to get concentrated with a few leaders right at the top who make all the big decisions.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Well, it means that power is held by just a handful of top leaders. These parties often don't maintain a proper list of their members. Regular meetings and internal elections, they just don't happen. As a result, the ordinary party workers have very little information and almost no say in the decisions. And what's the outcome? Personal loyalty to the leader becomes far more important than any loyalty to the party's ideas or principles. This first challenge, the lack of internal democracy, leads us directly to the second one, the problem of dynastic succession. You see, when there are no clear and transparent procedures for advancement, it becomes very easy for top leaders to give an unfair advantage to their own family members or close friends.
Now, why is this a challenge for a healthy democracy? Well, it means that top positions in the party are often controlled by members of just one family. This is obviously very unfair to other hardworking and deserving members of the party. It can also lead to people with very little experience or public support ending up in positions of great power. And that, as you can imagine, is not good for democracy. Let's move on to our third challenge, which is the increasing role of money and muscle power, especially during election time. Since the primary focus of any party is to win elections, they sometimes use shortcuts to achieve that goal. And this leads to a worrying trend. Parties tend to nominate candidates who can raise a lot of money or fund their own campaigns. This means wealthy individuals and big companies who donate to parties can then influence the policies of the government. In some extreme cases, parties even support candidates who have a criminal background, simply because they believe these candidates have a better chance of winning the election.
And that brings us to the fourth and final challenge we'll discuss today: the fact that very often parties do not offer a meaningful choice to the voters. You might look at the different parties competing in an election and feel that, deep down, they're all pretty similar.
Why does this happen? Well, in recent times, the big ideological differences between major parties seem to have become smaller. When it comes to fundamental economic policies, for example, many of them sound very much alike. This leaves voters who are looking for genuinely different policies with no real option. To add to that, we often see the same leaders moving from one party to another, which blurs the lines even more.
So, we've looked at the challenges, and they are quite serious. The big question now is, what can be done about it? How can these parties be reformed? Let's now explore the solutions.
Generally, when we talk about reforming political parties, the efforts can be grouped into 3 main categories. The first involves making changes to our Constitution and laws. The second path is through efforts by institutions like the Supreme Court and the Election Commission, and the third path involves various suggestions for future improvements.
Let's start with the legal reforms. One of the most important constitutional amendments was made to prevent elected MLAs and MPs from defecting, that is, from switching parties right after getting elected, often for a reward like cash or a ministry post. So what exactly do we mean by defection? It's when an elected representative changes their allegiance from the party they won the election with to a different party. The new law, known as the anti-defection law, states that if any MLA or MP changes their party, they will lose their seat.
This has definitely helped reduce this kind of party hopping. But some people argue it also makes it harder for representatives to voice any dissent against their own party leaders. The second major reform came from an order passed by the Supreme Court. In order to reduce the influence of money and criminals in politics, the court made it mandatory for every single candidate contesting an election to file something called an affidavit.
An affidavit is a signed, sworn document where a person has to give details about their personal information. So now, every candidate has to declare details of their property and assets, and also list any criminal cases that are pending against them. This has made a lot of information available to the public, which is a good step. But as of now, there is no system to actually check if the information given is true.
Our third reform comes from another powerful institution, the Election Commission. To encourage internal democracy within parties, the Commission passed an order making it necessary for them to hold their own organizational elections and to file their income tax returns. Parties have started doing this, but sometimes it is seen as just a formality.
Now, apart from these steps that have already been taken, there are several other important suggestions that are often discussed. For example, some people suggest there should be a law to regulate the internal functioning of parties, making things like maintaining a member register and holding regular elections compulsory. Another key suggestion is to make it mandatory for parties to give at least 1/3 of their election tickets to women candidates. And finally, there's the idea of state funding for elections, where the government gives parties money to fight elections to reduce their dependence on big corporations and wealthy donors.
This brings us to a very crucial question. We've talked about new laws, court orders, and rules from the Election Commission, but can they, by themselves, truly solve such deep and complex political problems? Just think about it for a moment. Are legal solutions enough?
Well, the honest answer is no. Laws and rules are important, but they are not the complete solution. And this brings us to the final and perhaps the most important ingredient for reform: you, the people. Real, lasting change requires the active participation of ordinary citizens.
So, how can we as citizens help reform politics? There are two main ways. The first is by putting pressure from the outside. Ordinary citizens, pressure groups, and the media can raise issues, protest, and demand reforms. If political parties feel that they are losing public support, they will be forced to take reforms seriously. The second way is participation from the inside. The quality of our democracy depends on the quality of public participation. If good people who want better politics decide to stay away, the space is left open for others. But if they join political parties and work to improve them from within, real change can happen. The problem of bad politics can only be solved by more and better politics.
All right, let's bring all of this together now. It's important to not just understand these concepts, but also to know how to present them effectively, especially for your exams. So, let's quickly go over how to structure a great, high-scoring answer on this topic.
Just follow this simple, logical structure. First, start by identifying the problems. Discuss the 4 major challenges that we covered: lack of internal democracy, dynastic succession, money and muscle power, and the lack of meaningful choice. Next, move on to the solutions. Explain the reforms that have already been made, like the anti-defection law and affidavits, and also mention the ones that have been suggested, like state funding. And finally, make sure you conclude with the most crucial point, that real change is not possible without active public participation. Remember, a good balanced answer always covers both the challenges and the reforms.